I'm Victoria, autism specialist teacher and mum to two very different children. I'm here today to talk to you about pathological demand avoidance, or PDA for short. Students with PDA are on the autism spectrum and therefore will struggle with many of the same things that others on the spectrum find difficult. They may have fixed interests, they may show repetitive behaviour, and they may have social and communication difficulties. But in addition to that, they will also struggle with a very real need for control. Any demand you put on them will be very difficult. Today's video is made with the aim of giving you some strategies that will help you make those students more successful in your classroom. I hope they help. Strategy 1. First impressions. First impressions are incredibly important for children on the autism spectrum. Our facial expressions and our body language are really difficult for them to read, and therefore it's really important that as they enter the room, your expression isn't neutral. A neutral expression can easily be confused with an angry one, a disappointed one, with the expression of someone who really doesn't like the people entering. Make sure you have a smile. Make sure you greet the students in a friendly way, even if you're having a really bad day. I know it's hard, but it really will make a world of difference in terms of getting children through the classroom door and in the right mood to learn. Secondly, for students with PDA in particular, it's really important to think about how you greet those students as they enter the room. For me, prior to teaching students with PDA, my welcome ritual went something like, hello, come in, take your bags off, take your coats off, sit down at your desks, pencil cases out. Before my students had even crossed the threshold of my room, I was giving them a list of demands I expected them to follow. Our students need those routines. They need to know what's expected of them when they enter the room. But the way in which we give them those routines often needs to change in order to ensure our students are successful. A checklist on the board can be helpful because that changes it from a demand to a routine and is much more likely to get students with PDA to engage with what's happening without straight away feeling as if they've lost control. Strategy 2. Relationship building. It's really important to build a relationship with a student with PDA. For those of you in secondary schools, I know this can be so difficult, especially if you only see the students for an hour a week. But just finding out about one of their interests and asking them one or two questions about it each week really will make a world of difference. It can be something small, like if you know they support a particular football team, asking them what the score was that week. If you know they like manga books, asking them which book they're reading at the moment. Or if you know they collect Yu-Gi-Oh cards, asking if they've had any new cards to add to their deck. It doesn't need to be a full-scale conversation. It just needs to be enough to show that student that you care more about them than you do about the demands that you're giving them. They need to see you as more than just a demand machine, and that really is key to getting them to buy into what you want them to do. Strategy 3. Don't take it personally. This one is really important. There are times that quite literally I've been told to F off 10 times before I've stepped into my classroom door in a morning. My students find the transition of coming from home, a relatively demand-free environment, into school, a very demand-heavy environment, very difficult indeed. What you have to remember is that these behaviours that we're seeing are often not led by a desire to behave badly, to upset the person that they are behaving badly towards. Instead, they're an expression of anxiety, of fear, of loss of control. If you think about how you would deal with a student who comes into your room scared and crying versus how we often respond to a student who comes in shouting and angry, then it's easy to think about what kind of changes we might want to make. Make sure you're calm, make sure you're measured, ask the student if they'd like some time out, and just remember that they aren't doing this to upset you. They're doing it because they can't handle the situation that they're being put in at that given time. With that in mind, when the students calm down, it's really important that we look at having a fresh start. I'm not saying that in some circumstances a measured sanction isn't appropriate, and we'll talk about that later. But what I am saying is that can be done with kindness rather than with anger. So make sure when they re-enter your classroom and they're calm, you greet them again with that smile and with a positive attitude of getting them back settled and working, rather than immediately starting to talk to them about what went wrong earlier in the day. Doing that, and your students knowing that when they re-enter the room, they will be re-entering the room to a positive attitude, will make a huge difference, and will mean that you're much more likely to get the student to return back to class quickly and ready to learn. Strategy 4. Be flexible yet consistent. In school, we all need rules. That's how schools work. And students with autism and with PDA really benefit from those rules being absolutely consistent. They need to know that if they're allowed to do something today, they're also going to be allowed to do it tomorrow and the day after and the day after. It's really key that you make students aware of what your rules are, what your boundaries are, and what any consequences will be in a measured way. Once they understand that, it's much easier for them to settle down within the environment and to accept the behaviours of others within the room, because they know what will happen if they step over the line. That said, it's also key to have some flexibility. So for instance, if your expectation of your students within your classroom is that they come in, they sit down and they begin the task at hand, that's fantastic. Students with PDA flourish in really settled classrooms. Where the flexibility comes in is you may just need to be willing to tweak your task. Keep your learning objective in mind the whole time. But as long as the learning objective's being met, does it really matter how? For me, that might involve changes like if I'm working on the First World War and I'm reading a novel set in wartime, and I want students to really express how it would feel to live in First World War Britain. That's my objective. That's what I want them to think about and empathise with. It may mean that I'm setting a task when I'm discussing my lesson that I want students to write a creative story set in First World War Britain, and most of my class might handle that. We've done a lot of prep, we've talked a lot about the feelings, we've set the scene, we've maybe read a novel. But then my student with PDA puts their hand up and refuses to do the task. There are several factors at play. Writing is extremely difficult for lots of students on the spectrum. Emotions are really difficult for lots of students on the spectrum. Trying to write creatively about an environment they've never been in is extremely difficult. So if I want some kind of buy-in from them, I'm going to have to be flexible. And I can do that in several ways. I can offer options to present the work differently. So perhaps they could do a video. They could interview somebody in the class about what it was like to live in First World War Britain. They could not do a totally creative piece, but they could talk about what it was like for one of the particular characters in the novel that we've written. Or I could be even more flexible. I could really go for a good chance of getting buy-in here. If the student has a special interest in, say, Pokemon, for example, a very popular one with our students, I could ask them how the Pokemon's going to feel landed in First World War Britain. It's a little bit crazy, it's never going to happen, but suddenly I've got my students' interest. They're suddenly starting to think about all the things that are different from our novel to the things that are different in Pokemon. Their eyes are lighting up, their interest is brought in, And suddenly I've gone from a student who is disinterested in the task that I've set to a student who's talking non-stop with ideas about it. I've got my objective met. I've got a student who is thinking seriously about life in First World War Britain. But at the same time, I've been a little bit flexible. I've been a little bit creative. And with students with PDA, that's often a big part of the answer. Strategy 5. Special interests really are your friend. As I've just demonstrated in the previous strategy, talking about a student's special interest can make a massive difference. It immediately engages them. It immediately shows them the different opportunities available. And it immediately taps into the part of their brain that shows them that you are interested in them as a person. The demand suddenly becomes less because you're asking them to think about something that they love rather than about something they have no interest in. It also becomes less because then they can immediately see that you're giving them back some control. You're thinking about their interests and you're trying to put them in a position where they can direct their learning in an area that they want to learn more about. You can utilise special interests in all kind of ways to your advantage, from getting a relationship built with a student, to calming them down after a meltdown with a discussion about something they really enjoy, to really getting that buy-in in a work activity. If you're teaching apostrophes and you know you've got a student who loves football, make an apostrophe sheet based on football. If you know you've got a student who really needs to practice their spelling, but really hates doing it, why not get them writing the names of Pokemon if that's their thing? At all times, if you keep in your head, what's my objective? What's my student's special interest? How can I tie those two together? You really will be onto a winner. Strategy 6. Have high expectations. So often I go into classrooms and I see students with PDA being sat at a laptop, being allowed to play on cool maths games, sitting at the side of the room with work that doesn't challenge them. Usually because someone like me has gone in and said lower the demands. Lowering demands doesn't have to mean lowering the challenge. You can still give a student with PDA incredibly challenging tasks and they'll thrive off it. You just have to present them in the right way. I find written instructions work really well because it's not like me giving a demand. Again, a really clear, simple checklist to follow as to the next stage in the task. I find negotiating works really well. So for instance, say I want a student to teach me about space and they're not all interested in space, but they really love manga characters. I might ask them to explain space to a manga character, at which point they might look at me and say, "But miss, that's absolutely crazy. This character only speaks Japanese." "Brilliant," I say. "Let's type it on the computer and use Google Translate to put it into Japanese." A tiny little bit of creativity really can make all the world of difference. That lesson hasn't taken me any extra planning. I've taught the same lesson as I have to the rest of the class. I'm getting the same objective as I am the rest of the class. They're learning about how space works and they're giving me a piece of written work explaining how space works. It's just got a tiny extra level in that I'm letting them translate it into Japanese. I still get my English copy, but they feel like they've had control and learn in the way that they're comfortable learning. That way I'm far more likely to see their best work than I am if I insist on keeping the control and having all the work done in the same way. Strategy 8. Rewards and sanctions. I'm a big fan of rewards. For me, if a student's worked really hard, if they've tried really hard to come out of their comfort zone and done something for me, I want to recognise that. I want to show them that I know the effort that they've put in and give them the reward that they deserve for doing so. Sometimes I use little edible treats, sometimes I use tokens to save up for bigger things, and sometimes I use free time as a reward. My students always know what they're working for and why they're working for it. But at the same time, I keep it low-key. It's not something I talk about constantly, and it's not something I hang over their heads. They know what systems are in place, they know they can achieve them. But at the same time, they know they're doing that for them rather than for me. And for students with PDA, that's really, really important, because if they feel like they have to get the reward for my sake, that's another demand I'm putting on them, another expectation, and something else that takes learning out of their control, and that isn't something that I want. When it comes to sanctions, getting it right can be really, really tricky. In my experience, for students with PDA, no matter what has happened, exclusions rarely work. And the reason they don't work is because for most students with PDA, school is extremely difficult. And if you give them an exclusion and send them home, they'll really quickly learn which behaviours they have to do in order to get sent home. And you will start to see an escalation in those behaviours rather than a de-escalation of them. If you want behaviours to de-escalate, you have to look at ways of enabling your student to keep calm. You have to look at things like the 5-point scale, zones of regulation, giving them somewhere quiet they can go to in school to relax until they've pulled themselves together and are ready to start learning. Perhaps giving them someone they can go and talk to in a safe environment when they're feeling angry. But sending them home is the wrong message. If you're looking for a sanction that works, you have to look to the individual student and you have to get the balance right. In my classroom, I use a technology ban. So if there's been any violence towards staff, towards pupils, if work's uncompleted, then we don't get our technology back. In the case of work, the work has to be complete before the technology time happens. In the case of violence, students initially are given a week's ban from the computers and from the iPads in our room. They can use them during lesson time, but not in their free time. For each day that the student manages to manage their behaviour, a day is removed off the ban. That gives students an incentive to keep calm, to keep working and to keep trying, even when they haven't got the thing they want most. I'm not saying that's the right sanction for everybody. It's about looking at your environment, it's about looking at your children, and it's about thinking, what type of sanctions can I give that are going to make my students have behaviours that work in this classroom, rather than about seeing a sanction as purely a punishment. Because if we see sanctions purely as punishments, they're rarely to have any long-term effect on what's going on. Strategy 9. I've left the most important strategy to last, and that is working with parents. I really can't overestimate how important it is to work with the parents of students with PDA. They will have strategies that I've never even thought of that work for their individual child. They will be desperate to work with you, to tell you everything that they know, and yet they're so often not asked. Their opinions so often aren't taken into account. You have a wealth of knowledge at your fingertips. You can find out what makes that student really anxious. You can find out how to combat those anxieties, and you can show a student just how much you care by involving their parents. Yet so often it's just not done. Give it a try. I promise it will make a difference. Thank you so much for listening to me today talk to you about the strategies. I hope some of them make a difference for you. There's lots more strategies available over on Starlight and Stories if you'd like to take a look. And as always, if you've got any questions, send me an email or get in touch via social media and I'll be more than happy to help. More videos will be coming soon. So if you'd like to subscribe to our YouTube channel, you'll get a quick notification every time new strategies are posted. Thank you so much for listening today. Bye bye.